Charles, thank you very much for having me. I know you're busy. You've got some weaners in the yards now I hear, and you've been racing up and down the motorbike to try and get this done. So I really appreciate you having me here today on your property.
No, pleasure, and well done on the project you're involved in.
Yeah, well, I got Bruce Pascoe yesterday, and you today, and I guess the first part of what I'd like to talk about is your journey into the regenerative sort of world,
Yep.
and where it led you today, and then we'll go more into the mindset shift, the paradigm shift that you talk about. So let's start with where did you grow up, and what got you into the lifestyle that you're in now?
Yep. Grew up right where we're sitting on a family farm. And then my father got really ill when I was about 22, so I left uni, come home to take over the management, finished part-time uni. And because I was more interested in zoology and animal behaviour research, I knew nothing about farm management. So I sought the best, in inverted brackets, best farmers in the district. They were family, friends and stuff. And so I became what I thought was a pretty good farmer. I was an industrial farmer. So I hooked in and ploughed country and quite often set stocked without moving animals because I knew no better. And we then walked into the 4 or 5 year drought of the early 80s. And I made the decision, I was developing a merino stud by then. And I made the decision that those genetics and our sheep were more important than the landscape. It seemed logical to me with that, what I would call the mechanical industrial mindset. But at the end of that, we ended up with a whacking debt, buying in grain, and the country was blowing. And I realised we had to make a change. So really that was the head-cracking event that opened me up. And of course, the early 80s, regen ag really wasn't on the radar, except for a few visionaries like Wendell Berry and people. So it really wasn't until the early 90s that I went to one of the, it was actually correspondence, which they don't do now for good reasons, but it was a RCS, Terry McCosker course. And he visited here in the early 90s. And so eventually, as we were evolving a really interesting merino stud based on molecular genetics and stuff, and that trapped me for a bit further, but eventually sold all that and we shifted right over to holistic grazing management. And having said that, since the 80s, we'd been searching around for viable native vegetation, trees, shrubs, etc. Because back in those days, there was no really good local nurseries growing local provenance varieties. So I'd always been, because of my interest in nature and zoology, I'd always been interested in nature, but my farm management was going against that. So it took some head-cracking stuff and I eventually woke up.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I noticed as I drove through the gates here is the sheer volume of grass that you've got. So, and the bird noises that we hear all around of us, obviously the biodiversity's paid off. That would have led you, I'm assuming, into the writing the book Call of the Reed Warbler, which was published in 2017, and from my point of view, was revolutionary in terms of agriculture and the way that we think about agriculture. Especially myself coming from an environmental science background, all you learn in university and as you go into the industry is agriculture has been detrimental, which it has in that traditional sort of conventional methods, but you're showing it's brutally honest where we've been in agriculture, but so that it's been part of that problem, but you're also showing that it can be part of that solution. And I have talked to a fair few podcasters that are very advocate style for the plant-based diet and stuff. I think there's the main confusion or misinformation that's coming around regen ag is the definitions. So in your own words, what is your definition of conventional agriculture and what's the definition of regenerative agriculture?
Full of easy questions, aren't you?
Yeah, sorry.
as a preface to this discussion and your earlier question, I'll just say that when I was at uni in the early 70s, I was privileged to do the first course in holistic thinking in Australia, human ecology. And because that will touch on mind shift and stuff
Yep.
in our discussion. And so we had it was right in that exciting time in the 70s when you had a lot of wonderful writers coming into that space. You know, Rachel Carson had just written a fabulous book, and Paul Ehrlich and all those sort of guys. And to have a worldview that showed that it's more than multidisciplinary, there's holistic thinking instead of reductionist, rigid science. Bearing in mind I was also doing a science degree in zoology. So that's a preface to that. I've now come around, I mean, I could define regenerative ag through its practices and stuff, but when I went back to do my PhD, which led to this book, and that was about 2009, I'd had about 4 decades out in the world away from academia. And in that time, we'd had the rise of the modern computer era and all that understanding. And what that gave us an understanding was complex adaptive systems. That whether it's an earth system, human body, a city functioning, these complex adaptive systems are hugely complex. There's huge amounts of things going on. And if there's a disequilibrium impact, say in a landscape, a drought or whatever, it will adjust and adapt. So my definition now of regen ag is landscape, a farmer's management of landscape and its functions that in effect allows that landscape to reorganise itself back to health, to self-organise. And that word self-organisation is critical in complex adaptive systems. So really, it sounds nebulous, but if you go around and examine all the top regen farmers, once they start doing things the way nature co-evolved for with animals and plants, the healing occurs, the soils get healthier, the biodiversity comes, the water cycle starts to work, da-da-da-da-da. So nature will self-organise. What we're doing, and to flip it on its head, you wanted the definition of industrial ag. It is, and I'd have to use the word understandably, because there's 12,000 years behind it, but it's the arrogance to think that we can control a living dynamic system. And so it's really simplifying it down, destroying its functions, so that we can pull the levers and manipulate monocultures and the inputs, etc., etc. So it's the dead opposite of, if you like, the humility to step back and let a self-organisation process occur.
Okay, good. And reductionist thinking, just explain that one quickly.
Right, well, we've been talking about holistic thinking, which is really, it's difficult because you have to have the humility not to think that you can know everything, but it's thinking in a really deep way that there's a greater wisdom out there in the way nature functions, etc., and that it incorporates all forms of knowledge, not just science, not just economics, but nature and if you like, spiritual issues and other things. Whereas reductionist thinking which is the rise of modern science from after the scientific revolution, which one of the most extraordinary, exciting times. Whether it was Adam Smith in economics, but particularly Newton and Descartes and all that sort of thinking, which I write about in my book, the rise of the mechanical mind. And that is, to understand an issue in modern science, you have to reduce it down to its elements. But in effect, yes, you can do that, and there's some wonderful science around. But big systems and self-organising planetary and landscape systems are indivisible because you can't divide them up and reduce them. They're interrelated, complex, multifactorial, and this touches on other work that relates to it in resilience thinking too. If you simplify a landscape to enough degrees, it loses its resilience and its capacity to regenerate and reorganise. So they're all tied up together. But it's reductionist thinking in the mechanical mind is the arrogance that we humans think we can reduce things to a simple level and then pull the levers. Whereas the opposite is, both regenerative and holistic, is empowering nature with her enormous complexity to regenerate through her own co-evolved systems.
I'm glad you touched on that more holistic way of thinking. It's kind of an evolutionary way to move forwards in agriculture. I want to touch on that a little bit later on in the talk. First of all, I want to go into the specifics of regenerative agriculture, some of the principles that you laid out in the book, and I've got to be honest, I've only got halfway through it at the moment because every single page has so much insight, so much knowledge, so I'm definitely taking my time with it. But I've read so far that there's 5 landscape functions or ecological functions, key elements, I guess, that sort of make up regenerative agriculture that we need to be aware of. Would you like to explain each one as well as you can?
And look, this 4 of them are sort of basic 101 botany, ecology. It's nothing new. Alan Savory, the great Rhodesian wildlife biologist who evolved a holistic grazing system, he nailed it pretty well in his early books. And so the 4 biogeophysical systems, it all starts with solar energy, obviously. Plants photosynthesize, pull the sugars down from that process to feed the plants, and then the carbon is fixed, and the whole thing gets rolling. And that in turn directly impacts the water cycle, number 2. So there's a solar energy cycle and there's water cycle, because carbon in the ground and the impact of biodiversity, which is the 4th function, but carbon in the ground, etc., enables the water cycle to get going, water to be stored better and deeper, etc., etc. Those 2 things then in turn impact the soil function, biodiversity, related to carbon, etc., etc., deeper plant roots, more sugars. So you've got solar, water, and the soil cycle, and then the 4th is biodiversity, because once you get those other 3, you've got diversity. You've got a range of plants that sustains insects, and in the soil, it's the same approach. As you get this full suite of biology that self-organises itself to help. So they're the 4. But when I started to think about industrial, mechanical approach to agriculture and this new revolutionary movement in regen ag, I realised it's the square foot of real estate between our ears. So I've added the 5th function of the human social, because of our belief system will determine the health of not just our landscapes but our entire planet. And that's the situation we're in now. And when I'm giving talks, I show those 5 cycles, and I show each of them is related by two-way arrows to each other. But if we go into, say, a paddock and plough the crap out of it, spray herbicide, overgrow the hell out of it, all those two-way interconnections across those 5, they're immediately destroyed. And hence the importance of it's basically a simple ABC technique of thinking and it helps you make decisions, as the holistic people talk about and teach. What's the weakest link in my approach? Is it my soil? Is it the biodiversity? Is it the water cycle? Whatever. So looking at those 5 arrows and those 5 functions, it's a pretty good methodology.
So the four biophysical elements that you went into just then, what are some good examples of how agriculture can enhance, either through crop or grazing, enhance all those cycles?
I can give you one pretty clear one. And I show this photo, must have been about 2009 or 10. I was going to interview a farmer in the upper Liverpool Plains when I was doing my thesis, which led to the book. And I cut across the top of the plains. So we're talking about deep black chocolate soil, some of the best soils in Australia, volcanic. And I'd been staying, I think, Gunnedah or somewhere the night before, and it was really dry year. But they'd had something like 8 to 10 mils of rain, a little shower that night. I came through next morning, 12 hours later, and right in the middle of the upper end of the Liverpool Plains, I stopped because just through the fence over a railway line, there's all this water lying around. And I thought, shit, in a dry time, 8 mils, what the bloody hell's going on? So I hopped over the fence and went for a walk. And those soils had been so over-ploughed, so over-fertilised, so over-sprayed, the structure was completely dead, they were thickly crusted. And 8 mils of rain could not penetrate some of the best soils in Australia.
Mm.
So that to me was an extraordinary example of destruction of the soil cycle, water cycle, and and everything that goes with a healthy, deep, penetrative soil.
How can we improve that with better practices? I know of rotational grazing. Are you a believer in cell grazing, planned grazing,
Yeah,
that kind of
we
thing?
practice it here.
Yeah.
Well, my answer to how do we improve that is directed to that example, because I ended up driving to the upper reaches of that soil, and this farmer, who was a regen farmer, growing crops, joined that country down near that railway line. And he grows sorghum and all sorts of other stuff, and uses no pesticides. And his neighbours are growing sorghum. They get hammered by the sorghum midge. But with his healthy, so he uses only organic fertilisers to grow his crops, and mulches and keeps his ground covered, all the sort of basic principles. But he says when the sorghum midges are on, you just see them attack the plants that have been fertilised and sprayed and everything. But they only hover around his crop because somehow that crop exudes this sign that it's healthy, but also there's predatory pests that live in amongst his crop and his land. Mm. So it was a dramatic illustration, and his soils, that 8 mils went in about 5 minutes, he said. So it was a classic demonstration of getting your landscape functions working versus simplified and destroyed.
Okay, and well, that's a good segue, I guess, into the next part that I want to go into is like, how do you actually become a regen farmer? Like, what are the questions that you're meant to ask as a first step, I guess? From a conventional sort of background, someone who's a third, fourth generational father, their fathers have been doing it for this long, what would you say to them to sort of get interested, or if they wanted to implement something on the ground, what would the first thing that they could do?
Yeah, good question. And I want to make it clear, having been an industrial farmer for a few decades, I'm not targeting individuals for thinking that way. I've been there, and I know what it's like. What I'm putting forward is an alternative way of thinking about regen ag. Making the shift is, best thing is go and talk to any regen farmers you know. Just see whether they're full of bullshit or what's behind what they're saying. Hop in a car and go and visit farms. Read what you can, but be open-minded about it. I mean, a couple of years ago I had to go and talk to one of Australia's leading rural universities. I spoke to the environmental course that they were running, and three students were all doing the course, but they were also mainly there to do the agriculture course. And I showed them the PowerPoint set up, and including that example of the Liverpool Plains, etc. And they came up to me. These three guys came up later and said, "That's totally different to what we're being taught in the traditional agriculture." I said, "The lecturer there says our job is to kill everything, and then we can control the inputs. So if you can get away from," and it applies to all of us, but the zealots, whatever, and try and find people who have made the shift, you'll find that they're really good farmers. They were good traditional farmers, but there's no arrogance in the good ones that I've encountered. They're more than happy to talk, and so just get out and read and learn and make your own mind up. Because what interested me in my thesis, which led to the book, I went and interviewed 80 regen farmers that have made this shift. It really interested me. What is the trigger? And in 60% of the cases, it had been some major life shock that had cracked open their mind.
That's what I was going to ask next, yeah.
Yeah. Poisoned by herbicide accident, big droughts, big animal disease incidents, those sorts of things that were head crackers, and big debt, losing a part of the farm, which happened to us. So it was something that really rattled a cage and cracked open their mind to get out on the track and learn whether there's another way of doing it.
Yeah, and it sort of raises a good point that humans in general, we're reactive because of the amygdala in our brain. That's our primal sort of instinct to react to things. And the next part that allows us to change is that slow cultural change. And I see that happening really slowly with Regen Ag now. Even 4 years ago when I was sort of started off on my regen journey, it wasn't well talked about, and then all of a sudden the drought hit and that was a little bit reactionary. People were going, is there a better way? And the regen ag started to surge after the major drought that we had. Obviously this sort of stems back right to European history, or as you say in your book, it goes right back 12,000 years. But in terms of just Australia, I guess, and we settled this country after the Indigenous, which is they were managing country in a different way. But in your book, you really explained it very well, that mindset, that mechanical mindset that we established and colonised this country within. If you could just go into that in detail, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't the one that came up with the mechanical mind. There's a brilliant ecologist and philosopher in America called Caroline Merchant, who wrote a book called The Death of Nature. And she tracked the evolution of Western thought beginning after the Renaissance with a lot of the great thinkers, Descartes and Bacon and then Newton and all those people. And it was quite an extraordinary process, because suddenly the Newtons of this world and the successive scientists in the 18th and 19th century, with that huge scientific revolution, we started to get an understanding of how nature worked, etc., how the world worked. But with that came hubris, because we thought with this powerful knowledge we can control everything, and we've gone on to do that. And if you wanted to sum up that process of reducing the world to scientific bytes and bits and structures and like a chemical chart and stuff, which is all great, wonderful stuff, but it's the opposite of that Indigenous and indeed the best of the regenerative view, which sees the world as a whole, totally interrelated, and once you start cutting the cake into little bits and reducing it down to the minutiae, you lose the essence of the whole, and with disastrous consequences, whether it's an atomic bomb used the wrong way or the worst of industrial agrochemicals. So it's a heady journey.
Yeah. You also mentioned, which really struck home to me, I sort of went in depth into it with Bruce yesterday, but the way that we colonised, and there was massacres of millions of Aboriginal people, and we applied that complete dominance mindset to nature itself, I guess. And what you're saying is, and what I talked about with Bruce yesterday, is that you have to align your mind, your heart and your mind, really more in tune with nature, I would say. Listen to it more so that you can understand the management that you can apply, I guess. And you sort of started talking about a paradigm shift, which I'm still trying to get my head around, to be honest. If you could go into what is that paradigm shift that we need to go through as a culture to get away from that sort of dominance, reductionist mindset?
I think that's one of the great questions of the 21st century, because friends of mine are some of the world's leading planetary scientists out of CSIRO and ANU, Will Steffen and John Finnegan and people. And they work with the leaders in the field at the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And they're looking at the planetary systems of which there are 9 that sustained. I mean, people don't realise that our blue-green Earth is the only planet in the entire universe with life on it that we know.
Yep.
And that's why it's blue-green.
Yep.
And 4.5 billion years ago it formed, but about 3.8 billion years ago some chance mutation or combination in primitive bacteria led to first life. So once that life got rolling, it's created this extraordinary blue-green planet. What was behind the question? Shows you how tired
So it was more around the paradigm shift. Yeah.
Okay. So that extraordinary story really sets this Earth as a complex, functioning, self-organising system. Then along comes modern Western science, and it started to dissect the cake, and with that came power, whether it was releasing of energy in the atom or ability to make chemicals for agrochemicals and modern medicines and stuff. So that vastly different approach, and the Indigenous world has got it, and good ecologists and you know, the best of the regen farmers, they see the whole first, that it's indivisible, and if you have to have the humility if you're going to go in and manage that, because you can very easily do lots of damage. The mechanical mind is the best and the worst of a thinking that reduces nature so you can it's to its understandable elements. It's whatever it is, the number of chemicals on the chemical chart, or how an atom works, how cutting up a cell, how that works. So that approach really has been termed, as opposed to the holistic approach that not primitive, that's the wrong word, of Indigenous people have got, because they don't look at it in breaking it into parts. They just have this extraordinary indivisible view of the world, whereas we modern scientists see to break it up into its understandable components, and that approach is really called a mechanistic approach versus the holistic or organic approach, which came out of that, what's called the organic mind.
Yeah, I have major difficulty arguing with scientists, academics about this exact point, where they just can't see the whole. You know, I'm in the carbon farming industry, and up in Cape York, trying to re-establish trees, basically vegetation, in a 40% coverage, but we're also using grazing to reduce fire principles and everything. And the sort of the plant-based view is just take the cattle off the land, and we'll, you know, everything will be self-organising, I guess, and everything will come back. But you've got fire now, and there was 60,000 years of management, land management in this country.
And megafauna before that.
And megafauna before that. So that reducing that vegetation. And as I've come through here, I came from Wagga Wagga last week, and I drove all through Kosciuszko down to Mallacoota and then back up. And it's personally devastating to me to see the bushfires. They've just taken out everything, and mainly in national parks, Kosciuszko and the rest of it. So how do we get away from that? How do we get academics? Academics are really a bit of a roadblock in the end, saying, and they're definitely useful. We definitely need that academic science, but we need people to think more holistically, like you say, to incorporate everything. Actually, get out on country and see the problems that we're facing, and know that science alone can't solve it. Science can help, but we need to have a different point of view. How do we convince people or influence people that there is a better way, and that it's not just science, it's an evolution, a more evolutionary, indigenous way to think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great academics, and we need that scientific understanding to explain all the issues to do with fire. You know, that when you practice Indigenous burning, it's not just flames. Smoke has 23 or more chemicals in it, which stimulates propagule formation of native vegetation, because a huge percentage, over 70% of Australia's vegetation is adapted to fire. And I think what you may be hinting at is that prior to 1788, there were some pretty good managers of the landscape around, which was Indigenous people. And only about, talking to a senior elder friend of mine, only about every 2-3 centuries would you get a Holocaust event like happened before, whereas we're getting them regularly now. So that's starting to tell us something. It's not just the change in the climate, which is human caused this time, but it's the way we don't manage fire at the right time. And any of the explorers in their journals, etc., there's always smoke in the Australian landscape from Indigenous people burning at the right time. So yeah, we need the scientific understanding of fires and smoke, but we need to have the humility to acknowledge that Indigenous people were masters at fire management. And I personally would think that most of our national parks should be managed by Indigenous people and let them go ahead and burn at the right time.
Yeah, get back on country and see it on the ground. When I was talking to Bruce yesterday, he's actually saying that, you know, you get on country and you feel it and you see it and you know where it's going to end, where it's going to pull up. And Victor Stephenson's book Fire Country sort of really outlines that as well. Yeah. That sort of more, whereas our sort of methodical way of doing it, and I've done it myself in the environmental industry, is you plan. You say, you go out and you look at a map and you say, this block's going to be burnt in year 1, this block's going to be burnt in year 3. It's a plan. It's not going out and reading it. So,
I mean, they'll walk across country in barefoot. Victor Stephenson and them said you shouldn't be walking when you're burning in anything but bare feet, but they'll walk at any time of the year and they'll know when it needs to burn just through, and they'll know when to burn with the right humidity and that in air inversion lay when the humidity starts to build and all that sort of stuff. And why in the hell we have this arrogance towards people that have got 60 millennia of managing country, I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess it's part of the conversation. I think it's slowly happening, but again, it's too slow for me. So I'd like you to give me a bit of hope here, if you can. The rate at which the climate is changing. Obviously, the climate's changed in the past before, but it's happening, you know, up to 200 times faster than what it did, and from the last ice age, according to Will Steffen. Actually, he was the one who sort of came up with that figure. So how, in terms of that, the rate at which the climate and the landscapes and all the management that we need to keep up with this climate shift is now happening, how do we actually get people along this journey a lot quicker? I guess they're coming along the journey, but how would we transition that at a rate that is required to start reversing the climate shift and not increasing it?
Recently I've been doing a lot of reading in this area and talking to and reading to people like Will Steffen, etc. And Paul Hawken, a friend who I've worked with his new book Regeneration and Drawdown before that. I think all the leading scientists in this field think we've got one generation, 25 years, to turn this around, or we're a very high likelihood we're getting into runaway climate events with the Earth systems and we're stuffed. It's that urgent. But when you look at the short-term political cycle and the power behind the industrial mechanical world, it's getting harder and harder, even though the shocks are coming more. And I know this last big drought and the heat of last few summers has really rattled the cage with a lot of farming people. How do we turn that around? Well, that is the challenge on which our whole species is now hanging, because I agree with the scientific analysis that we've got less than 25 years to turn this around.
Yeah, and if there's one thing that the governments could do, because I know that sort of the agricultural change is shifting, probably not, it's not fast enough, but it's slowly coming along. How could government policy or any programs or incentives that they could give, what do you think about that? What could they do best?
Oh, they could do a lot, but I've never yet seen government policy lead a necessary change. It's always bottom up.
Yeah.
That's why I often talk about this being an underground revolution. It's always the innovators and the mavericks who are going to lead with something. Government will only change when there's votes in it and they can see the necessity in it. And I hate to sound like a cynic. Let's go back a step. if you look at the structure of the entire Earth now, which is, and its governance, which is captured by the big multinationals, even if you're in the Amazonian rainforest or something, you're still impacted by what's happened. So you've got these huge power structures, all the great multinationals in chemistry, in agriculture, in food processing, in shipping, enormous power. All the Western and many of the Eastern governments are now captured by that. So the government level, it's all still predicated on that. You know, people like NFF, their main sponsor's Bayer, one of the world's biggest. You know, and that's just a small example. The universities, well, you've got government policy favouring industrial agriculture, etc., etc. So then your universities are teaching that universally. Your technical colleges, what's left of them. And so the whole thing filters down. We once had good departments of agriculture extension officers. Now it's the chemical salesmen that are the advisors on how to grow a crop. And I've used examples in the book and elsewhere. They just come out with a recipe of X number, sometimes up to 40 chemicals to use throughout the year. And farmers follow them blindly because they're the experts. So it's all about power. And this underground revolution, it's a radical challenge to that power base. And that's why the fight is so vicious in trying to squash this movement. But the other half of this movement is a growing awareness in the urban population for healthier food, which has to come off healthier landscapes, or it hasn't got the nutrient density and richness and the phytochemicals in it. So it's a double revolution going on here. There's a farming challenge, contesting the dominant industrial, mechanical, and then there's the urban population that are waking up to it as well. And that, to me, holds a lot of hope.
And from a more urban perspective, that plant-based diet is becoming fairly mainstream. Do you think that can help balance out the high demand for beef in that sort of more conventional? Do you think there's a part to play for plant-based diets?
Yeah, I mean, it's like all debates, an extreme push always worries me. I mean, people don't realise we as a human species evolved in the African savannas. So your average hunter-gatherer around the world, and would be the case then, can identify at least 500 different food and medicinal plants in an environment. Your men, traditionally, just because of physiological differences, went off and did most of the hunting. But they weren't just getting meat. And I've had the privilege of working with someone like Fred Provenza, Utah State Uni, who just retired regrettably, but he was did all the pioneering work on shrubs, the vertical layer in our landscape, which are full of phytochemicals, tens of thousands of them, terpenes, tannins, etc., etc. And the animals were eating them as well as browsing grass, and they could self-medicate. You know, we have wattles here, acacias, and I've seen sheep and cattle with one particular wattle. They go for it every time because they're self-medicating intestinal worms. So, but they're eating and recognising, and modern ruminants, sheep and cattle, still have that ancient knowledge to smell the phytochemicals in plants. The point I'm getting to is that we are co-evolved still, because we haven't shifted too much, to have this huge range of diversity of, you know, primary nutrients and minerals, but also a whole range of chemicals and phytochemicals. So if we go down a pure plant-based diet, we're going to compromise, the proviso being animals that graze healthy landscapes and have access to that diversity. But if we go down just a plant-based diet, we're definitely chopping out a lot of really key minerals, nutrients, phytochemicals that we're co-evolved for. So I'm not in favour of feedlots. I think it's horrendous, and they're not getting anywhere near 1,000th of the potential diet and nutrients and phytochemicals, etc., that you will get off a healthy landscape. So, and I'm not saying we should eat the huge kilo numbers per head of meat that we're eating, especially of a feedlot situation. But if we want to, for some reason, when we have these food debates, we take an extreme view and everyone stampedes down the latest fad. It's always a balance, and good doses of meat, dairy, of healthy landscapes is fundamental. So let's not jump out of the frying pan of the fire on this one.
I think that's what your book does really well too, is provides a balanced viewpoint, which leads back to holistic management and holistic thinking. And I'd like to go a little bit into that if we could now. The holistic mindset. I've heard a lot of people claim that, you know, like we were sort of the first ones to come up with that term, but the and I want to hear your point of view on this. The research that I've been doing is that the Aboriginal elders were probably the best holistic thinkers in the landscape, and they operated within their clans, which was all within ecological niches. Well, I was talking to Bruce yesterday about Aboriginal law, and the law were the set of economic, social and environmental principles that were across the entire Australia, that were communicated across the entirety of Australia, but the principles remained the same within each ecological niche, but the management techniques would change according to the different landscapes, etc. And as humans, I guess we're very trained to think of one thing at a time. And we want to identify with one thing as well, like whether I'm a vegan or I'm a meat eater or whatever, we want to identify with that because that's how we
we seem to have this binary push, either or sort of stuff. Yeah.
Social conformity, I guess. How the holistic way of thinking is nearly, when you talk about the 8 levels of consciousness, I sort of align it with that highest level of consciousness, really, in the human evolution. And I guess that's where we need to get to with agriculture is helping people get to that sort of enlightenment, I guess. And I've had sort of moments of it in my regen journey where I've sort of felt like I've been in tune or I've been thinking more holistically. But because of my work, you know, in the industry, and as an environmental scientist and everything, I tend to slip back into that sort of what you refer to, and everyone that's in this space, as reductionist thinking. I definitely do slip back into that. How would you suggest that we sort of start thinking more holistically? Firstly, what is it? Was that definition that I provided good enough? And how would you suggest we start learning more about it to get to that enlightenment sort of point of view?
Well, I guess I was privileged to do one of the first, I think it was the first course in Australia in holistic thinking called Human Ecology. So I would really strongly urge people, before you go and specialise in a science specialty, or whether it's into arts or whatever, do an holistic course that covers the full spectrum. And because by doing that, if it's well taught, they will give you your essays or your thesis, which has to incorporate all the different knowledge cultures. So it's forcing you into thinking differently. Because as you say, we are trained to go down these single narrow tracks. I guess what really woke me to how holistic leading Indigenous people are is, I've been privileged to befriend and spend time with a senior lawman, local Ngarigo man. And I remember we were, and we've got an Aboriginal camp up at the top of the place, and a big water cistern area where once it's cleaned out it fills up. It's 10 mils of rain, so it was a pretty special spot. And he described how they would have camped up there, but he described when he was being a trainee on the pathway to becoming a man of high degree, they were consciously taught at about 14 or 15 to use the different parts of the 2 different hemispheres of their brain. And then when you combine that with a 60,000-year aggregation of knowledge through ice ages and fire and all the rest of it, and brutal survival in the face of the challenges that brought up, and as you said, the complex social relationships they've got, not just to prevent intermarriage, but a lot of it is targeted at management and preservation of the very ecology that they're dependent on. That can't help but force you into more holistic thinking. And I think if you could do a conscious course that teaches it, but especially look at something like ecology, which should be all about interrelationships and those other dimensions, that should start to break this reductionist paradigm that sets you on this very narrow tunnel of one-way thinking.
Do you think that's going to help not just in agriculture, but in different society and different work environments overall?
I would hope so, but gee, it's a bit like re-engineering an entire new building. We're so predicated on this traditional reductionist approach in all spheres of life that, I mean, there are good examples around the world in architecture and education and natural sciences, but the predominant thinking is reductionist mechanical.
Yeah, yeah. And you've got another couple of books that you're writing at the moment, don't you? Does it go more touch on this stuff as well?
No, I've just published a children's book on a very rare lizard about that big that we found on the place, but there's an essay at the back. Because I think what worries me is you just got to drive around the new suburbs in Australia. The backyards are gone from about 50% to 5% if you're lucky. It's all, the houses are black, heat absorbent, and the divorcement from nature is just horrendous, you know. And the statistics by people like Planet Ark show that children under 10, for every hour of outdoor play, there's 10 hours in front of a screen, all that sort of stuff. And 1 in 4 has only ever climbed a tree or a rock, and that sort of stuff, under the age of 6 or something. Really alarming. And if you want to learn about holistic thinking, nature will teach you.
Reconnect, yeah. Yeah, so that reconnection to nature is one of the biggest messages that I have as well, because that's more of a spiritual connection that I think that we're missing, that the Indigenous had, because they were actually living on the land. And now that we are living in concrete buildings, driving to work in a concrete box, going to look at a concrete screen all day and then going back to our concrete unit or whatever, it's a complete disconnection to nature. And the Victor Stephensons of the world that talks about, you know, walking through barefoot for the bush, that's not just about reading country, I don't think. I think that's about getting more spiritually connected to country, feeling country.
And earth energies, you know, I've done some courses in subtle energies and stuff, and that's for real, you know. I can divine water and earth currents a bit. I haven't really pursued it, but I mean, there's some pretty interesting stuff, and that knowledge has been around forever, and the Indigenous people are very across that there are energy lines around the earth. I mean, this is radical for some people. Just call it spiritual or biophysical, whatever you want to, but it's reality. But the deeper thing, connecting to nature, has to have, to me, a more of a spiritual element. You know, one of my heroes is St. Francis, but they're sadly lacking at the moment in some of the modern religions. But you know, which I think is hugely important, the spiritual element, because that's what's really going to connect us with the earth and nature, and instead of thinking that we can survive as in these concrete and steel jungles and destabilise the planet with impunity. We can't.
Do you think we can do it in 25 years? Do you think we can flip it on its head and start?
Oh, look, I'm devoting my life, or a fair bit of my life now, to writing and talking and stuff. I guess I'm silly enough to think that I'm still optimistic we can turn it around. I think we're going to need. We're talking about those regenerative farmers that had shocks. There's some bigger shocks coming. Those bushfires the other day were only babies in the woods compared to what's going to hit, and that's about the only thing that'll change us. Whether we will change in time, I don't know, because the power of this greed, the big multinationals, is just enormous. But I think there is a huge momentum gathering, and you just got to look at, you know, Paul Hawkins' 2 recent books, Drawdown and Regen. It's some wonderful stuff in there that shows that there's this gathering momentum across the planet, and what David Attenborough's been doing, and all those sort of guys.
Yeah, I think Paul Hawkins speaks wonderfully, to be honest, on those type of contexts. Yeah, I don't know if you know much about the carbon farming industry, but it's sort of based on regenerating nature and turning that into a profit, basically, sort of flipping that model on its head. Do you think that can help in transition conventional methods into more regenerative?
Yeah, I do. There's some questions over methodology and etc. We haven't got involved yet. I think it's one of the exciting tools in the tool chest. It's not the only one, but I think it's going to have a big impact, because suddenly any farmer's doing the right thing can at last be rewarded. I've been temporarily involved in, I'll go back a step. I think things like biodiversity credits, etc., are really important, and we have covenants on about 500 acres of our grassland to manage for regeneration, which works in with our management anyway, but we're paid for doing the right thing, and that has really exciting stuff. There's now covenants for koala habitat preservation, etc., and all sorts of instruments along those lines to foster a regenerating of our ecosystems and our landscape functions are all to the good. And it's a wonderful signal that at last the commercial world realises that if you give a bit more carrot rather than just the cane, that farmers will respond very quickly. I mean, we've all got to make a living. And what's happening with our industrial soils is the more that you poison them, the less productive they're getting. The more you flog sheep and cattle set stocking, the less productive and the less resilient they are. So any of these instruments, I think, are hugely important in shifting. You know, a lot of our talks have been about the change of the mindset, the paradigm, and I think these tools are really a very subtle, clever way to start getting that shift.
And you've definitely seen, from your more conventional methods into regenerative, you've seen an increase in agricultural productivity across your landscape?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, it's not just the actual physical nature of the land, it's the flexibility to manipulate your stocking rates so that you're selling in, because you're reading your soil moisture profile and those sorts of things, you're selling 3-4 months more early while the animals are fat and before the markets are crashed. So you're making money on those swings and roundabouts. You're not buying drought feeds. You know, the worst of the last drought we adjusted and sold down when the prices were good. That's why the country's pretty big now. I'm not going in on the current market. The country's having a rest and it's rebuilding and mulching. So without doubt, we don't have a debt. It's just so much easier to manage. People think, oh, if you got all those paddocks, isn't it harder if you're moving them every 2, 3, 4 days? Well, it's actually not, because you've only got 1 or 2 or 3 mobs at the most. Mm. So there's so many, and the extra meaning in life in regenerating land and your learning curve with a community of practice, a group of really forward-thinking scientists across the spectrum, and particularly farm managers and others. It's a really exciting path to be on. And on top of that, we know that we're helping the planet, because that's, without doubt, that's humanity's greatest challenge.
Well, Charles, your wife's just turned up, and I know you've got stock to move around, so I'll let you go. But I really appreciate the chat, and thanks for your insight. I will be looking forward to your new books after I get through your first one, or called The Red Warbler anyway. But thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Much appreciated, mate.